And after calling Vladimir Putin crazy for his drone attacks on Ukraine, U.S. President Donald Trump has launched another broadside at the Russian leader. Trump posted this on his Truth Social platform. What Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with fire. So let's unpack this with Liz Schuelke, a U.S. policy analyst currently here in Berlin. Liz, good to see you here in the studio. So we've seen Trump call Putin crazy, warn that he is playing with fire. What do you make of this tone shift?
It has been really developing over the last 24 hours from about a week ago, Trump having a call with Putin, in addition to other European leaders at different times, kind of saying there will be negotiations, there will be a ceasefire. And this kind of escalation over the last few days, I think, really signals a couple things, some of them political and some of them personal. Trump sees himself as the ultimate negotiator. And notice in that quote, he says, I've known him for a long time. I think Trump really takes it. It's meaningful to him that he has built this relationship with Putin, and he thinks it carries a lot of weight. So on the personal front, I think he's very offended and upset that it seems as though Putin isn't necessarily he's doing something other than what he probably told President Trump a week ago on the phone. And that's making Trump feel a little bit like, wait, where's my word on this? And on the political, he is getting a ton of pressure from Europe and even from inside the States to kind of hold Trump to account.
Mm-hmm. So how much of this is him just, reaching out, expressing himself after feeling offended, this sense of betrayal over this personal relationship? And how much of it is a serious signal to Vladimir Putin?
I was reading that the Kremlin responded and said everyone is emotional. I don't think that quote's going to land particularly well with Donald Trump. And I think the president actually is quite serious on this. He likes to be taken seriously. He likes to be seen as a strong deal maker. There is kind of common knowledge in Washington that Trump listens to the last voice he heard. And that's where sometimes he has this stereotype of, he'll get really emotional and then he'll backtrack. But I think there's enough mounting pressure and some of the reactions of very high level Republicans on X and on social media that will really, I think he really has some weight behind this on this one.
Yeah, I'm interested in how the Republican Party shapes the way Trump is thinking. Obviously, there's been a lot of pressure in his election campaign to reduce U.S. support to Ukraine. Is there a world in which we could see this reverse and him really put full-throated American support behind Kyiv in the domestic environment that he's operating in?
Absolutely. I actually think it might be surprising to some if he were to kind of look at some of the sanctions he's talked about with Russia or really support Ukraine or hold Putin accountable for a peaceful ceasefire. There might be a much warmer reception in a Republican Congress than currently you might believe. Part of it is if we look at the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he has a history of being very strong on Ukraine and very strong on holding back Russia. The tone shift for him was last year during the presidential election. And so in some ways, it's not the Republicans making the policy for Trump. It was Trump making the policy for Republicans. And traditionally, Republicans are the party that is strong against Russia. So it was a little bit of a head spin for all of us when they flipped on that. So I think there would be a lot of senior, older Republicans that would welcome a stronger stance here by President Trump.
Yeah, like so many things that flipped on its head. How much do you think this is a matter of Trump's political credibility, both at home and internationally, of him having this credibility on the line if he fails to actually get a deal done?
Absolutely. What was his famous phrase? I'll end the war in 24 hours. And there was this painting of the reason the war hadn't ended is because of his predecessor, President Biden, couldn't get it done. Europe couldn't get it done. And he's this great deal maker. So I think you've hit the nail on the head that there is absolutely for him what he perceives as a credibility at stake, that he has a special talent in his head for negotiating, and specifically that it was worth it to have this close relationship with Russia and with Putin that may have been scrutinized by other world leaders because it means I'm going to get stuff done. And if Putin kind of makes a fool of him by just one of the largest attacks in a long time on Ukraine. I think Trump is going to see that as a blow to his credibility.
I mean, many Europeans will be looking at this, scratching their heads, wondering what's going on. Does Trump have some plan that we don't know about behind the scenes? What would you tell them about what is going on in the United States and within the White House that can explain this moment that we're in?
I think what I would say is it is very meaningful when top Republicans say something, because there is a tendency in the Republican Party, and especially under a Trump presidency, to really toe the company line. And by that, I mean they tend to fall in step. You tend to see a lot less dissent than you might see in a Democratic presidency. For example, Rubio really shifted his tone coming into this administration on Ukraine. So the fact that we have very top Republicans making a statement, and I also think Trump is very serious. But at the end of the day, you always have to keep in mind with President Trump, there is the old adage that he listens to the last person in the room. And that can sometimes make him seem outwardly erratic because you're thinking just last week he said this is. So always hold that when you're seeing momentum, that what if he has a great call that he perceives with Putin and it changes it. But I think it's a pretty significant step that there is high-ranking Republicans feeling safe enough to come out and make a stance.
Everything could change in a heartbeat. Thank you so much for your analysis there. That is Liz Schuelke. Such a delight to have you in the studio today.
Thank you.
And for more, let's bring in Angela Stent, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I'd like to start with that news coming from Washington just recently. President Trump saying that Putin is playing with fire and that really bad things would have already happened to Russia if it weren't for him. What do you think he means by that?
Well, I mean, he's realizing that all of his attempts to get a peace deal, which he promised he could get in 24 hours and then in 100 days, are not materializing. And I think he's beginning to understand that Putin is playing with him. However, he's now, criticizes Russia. He threatens more sanctions and more weapons for Ukraine, but he hasn't actually done anything. And the rationale in the Trump administration as well, they don't want to do anything to make it less likely that there will be successful peace negotiations. But we're really at a point where the only reason why Putin started negotiations with the Ukrainians is because the European leaders, with Chancellor Merz and French, British, and Polish leaders had threatened more sanctions on Russia if it didn't agree to a ceasefire. Putin then said, well, we'll have negotiations, but those have really gone nowhere.
So how concerned do you think Putin is about upsetting the U.S. president?
He's somewhat upset. He's somewhat careful in what he says, but clearly he is not taking any actions, which are the ones that Donald Trump has asked for. So he may be mildly upset, but as you yourself said in your report, the bombings and the attacks on Ukraine have intensified in the past couple of weeks, including just before the negotiations in Istanbul between Russians and Ukrainians. So he is determined to win this war. He believes that he can, and he's using negotiations right now as a delaying tactic.
Now, Chancellor Friedrich Merz said yesterday that Germany and other European allies have lifted range limits on missiles that they're supplying to Ukraine. In your view, could this change the course of the war?
I think it will help the Ukrainians. It's very important that they have lifted those restrictions because Ukraine was handicapped beforehand. But I think in order for Ukraine really to be able to push the Russians back more, they need a large number of weapons. There's, of course, the question about whether Germany will supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine, how many more Patriot batteries they'll get, either from the U.S. or some of its allies. And I think the only thing that would also cause Putin to rethink this is if indeed there are much tougher sanctions. The EU has already imposed some and would like to impose more. It's not clear what the U.S. will do.
And do you think Europe is showing enough muscle toward Russia? Has it lost in some ways its fear of how Putin might respond to its efforts to support Ukraine?
I mean, I think the leading European countries, the so-called coalition of the willing, again, the UK, Germany, France, and Poland, I think are showing enough muscle and are acting as if they're less inhibited about supporting Ukraine than they were before. But of course, Europe isn't completely united on this. And the next test will come when the EU discusses maintaining the sanctions or even increasing them on Russia and seeing what Viktor Orban, for instance, the Hungarian prime minister, would do.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today on DW News. It has been a real pleasure hearing your insights. That is Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution.